Kia ora koutou katoa, Bilavanaka, malo elele, talofa lava, and welcome to this virtual theology chat with the Anglican Women's Studies Centre. This evening, we're very pleased to welcome Bridie Marsden Boyd, Jess Hall, and Tepene Marsden. Bridie is a counsellor for the Anglican Women's Studies, and she is going to explain how the three of them are connected and how they're going to work tonight together. So I hope you enjoy this presentation.
Kia ora and welcome here this evening. We are Bridie, Jess and Tepene. Jess is in a separate video in a separate location. And the three of us are really passionate about restoring hope and deepening people's relationships and community with Christ, particularly through strategic means. We've met several times in our life so far across different churches and have become close friends and now work together to kind of restore this hope. We would like to give a small disclaimer before we really kickstart the talk today. We are not offering a silver bullet. We are sorry about that. But we are really hoping to inspire you with some practical tools for reviewing your Sunday service spaces. I'm going to speak first, and then Tep will jump in the middle, and Jess will round us off at the very end. So sit back and enjoy. The early church formed to meet the needs of people who were wanting to bond over a new and growing faith. Our sermons were created to meet a need of a community with low levels of literacy and theological scholarship. Reading the gospel out loud was designed to meet the need of a people who didn't have access to a personal Bible. The Salvation Army was set up to counter the growing levels of addiction in the local community, and church bands were created to use modern music to engage new and younger generations. These examples are just some of the ways that show that church works best when it is providing targeted solutions to the needs of the community, when it offers a hopeful alternative to existing problems. Currently, we have a model that assumes the successes of the past are required for the successes of the future, that it is necessary to still read the Bible out loud, to still have a sermon, that we still need to use a worship band to attract younger generations, even though that particular audience has aged and are now middle-aged. I'm a mental health chaplain, and I have years of experience working with people struggling with mental health challenges. So I know very much what insanity looks like. And I can confirm the old saying, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, is true. So one issue for church in particular is we tend to suffer from something called survivorship bias. A common example of survivorship bias stems from World War II, when statistician Abraham Banks used it to minimize plane losses. So the diagram on the screen shows you a series of red dots. Each red dot is where a plane was shot or shot in multiple cases. So this is where the engineers were focusing their efforts and they were reinforcing the places that had been shot the most. However, what this diagram actually shows you is where planes can get shot and still come back to base. So these planes survive. Planes that get shot in the white spaces don't come back, and so are never included in the data. It's actually the white spaces that you need to reinforce, or the areas that you have no information on. So survivorship bias is when your only information is coming what has already survived. So when we as church gather together and ask ourselves, well, what areas do we need to improve on? It's only the survivors who are reporting in. It's the people who church is already working for who are telling us that we need a Sunday service in a particular time and style. But is this the case? Well, for the majority of people, services fail to meet their spiritual needs, and we know this through our census data. So 37% of New Zealanders identify as Christian, but actually only 14% attend church monthly and less than 10% go weekly. But it's this 10% who have the most say over how a service looks. This is because the existing model works for them, but it's not working for the remaining 90%. So we actually have to stop asking churchgoers what they want church to look like and start asking non-churchgoers what needs to happen for them to come along. Additionally, it's very hard for churches to compete and attract newcomers because New Zealand culture has changed. Sunday morning used to be a time set aside for sacred and spiritual activities, but now it competes with work shifts, side hustles, school sports, brunches, family schedules, and my favorite, the rather alluring sleep-in. So, if you're not Christian already, why would you pick church? And if you are Christian, we can turn to other places. So why would you want to listen to a sermon from a well-meaning pastor when you could listen to one from a biblical scholar or famous priest? Why would you endure a less than stellar band when Spotify can give you the best? As mentioned earlier, only a quarter of those who call themselves Christian attend church weekly. So if we can't even get our own through the doors, why would we expect the unchurched to come? This brings me back to my original point that perhaps churches need to look at the needs of their communities and where they could bring hope. So in New Zealand, 42% of people have actually said that they felt lonely in the last month. 1 in 3 women experience abuse in their lifetime, and 12.5% of children are in poverty. Now, this doesn't mean that every church needs to tackle all of these, and there are other issues all around. Every community will have a crucial unmet need. What I know is that churches can provide hope and transformation, but offering traditions without thought, using language that nobody understands, is not the solution for us. Our Sunday morning services struggle to meet modern spiritual needs, and our responses typically seek a return to the good old days. So perhaps when we talk about a lack of hope in church, it's because our focus is now on numbers and seats and not on needs being met.
Well, kia ora, Bridie. Thanks for clarifying what is happening in our world and just sort of being a downer. So we don't want to obviously end on that point. We want to see how we get hope and how do we actually start meeting some of these needs and not be overwhelmed and hopeless. So firstly, I want to acknowledge a biased theological understanding that Jess, Bridie, and I have in our church community had. We believe that we are on a regular basis talking and engaging with the creator of the universe. This means that we're talking with the being responsible for creating creativity itself. So if we're struggling to come up with creative solutions, it's something we're doing that's slowing up the process, not God. Creative universe, right? So with this sort of understanding in our own context in our church community, we believe we're talking to the best possible entity on tap, objectively on tap, and an amazing, capable, intelligent team, all able and capable of producing good quality stuff. We're backed by church leadership. So why are we struggling to meet all of those spiritual needs? We were finding that one of our tools was not actually serving us as well as we thought it had been. That tool is our language. See, when we started jumping into this, we naturally defaulted to our sort of cultural, theological Christianese language to describe all our outcomes and goals in meeting those spiritual needs. If you haven't heard the term Christianese before, it's the collective term for all the words and phrases and vocabulary that Christians use in the Christian tradition. Or more succinctly, Christian jargon. It reflects thousands of years of human history, intersecting cultures, scriptures, and revelation from God. It's a beautiful tapestry of our collective history, and therefore is focused on supporting our theological discussions, all about our faith and experiences in it. We use this tool to great effect, creating more productive theological discussions. And we do this largely by using lots of container words and shorthand to grasp really complex and abstract ideas, which most of our faith is filled with. This feature, although incredibly helpful when we're discussing theology, has an unintended consequence. The language we use must be incredibly expansive to hold all of that complexity. Specificity, accuracy, and concrete tangibility, which is directly needed for writing tangible outcomes, clashes with the real vague abstract words like these. If you basically have to ask a few times, so what does that actually mean? It's likely to be a Christianese word. Words like discipleship, for example, on the list, although excellent for setting vision and containing deep, rich nuance, doesn't actually help us define what next steps we need to take. It means too many different things to too many different people. There's no sort of measurable outcome when we don't know how we can even achieve discipleship. It's so open-ended. So the trick here is we were as we were working through this process, we wanted to start using the right tool for the right job. And that was part of our language, we were using the right language for the job. I know everyone's listening to this right now, all have people in your church communities who are operations people, managers, process-focused people. And like, what would it look like if we started using them to write the outcomes and ignore Christianity, put the theological words away for a second and start just using boring, even corporate language, and allow those people who flourish in that space to flourish and help us define quality outcome. I'm going to give you so one more example of the sort of how we get ourselves sort of in a bind, and then Jess will show us how we applied it in a real world context. Right, so example here is we typically say church equals good. Everyone here would probably agree somewhere in that continuum that that's a true statement. And the Christian tradition typically supports this idea too. Therefore, if this is good, church is good, we'll do church. But again, because the term church is so incredibly vast and holding just libraries of content, we could have an infinite amount of options available to us. So we found quickly when we approached the problem from this angle, we got overwhelmed and just defaulted to what we already knew. So in this example, when we say church, we quickly shorthand it to something like this: the Sunday morning lecture and a sing-along. Now, I didn't write that. I asked a church leader to summarize the standard Sunday morning service in plain, clear English with no Christianese. And that's what he came up with. I think it's beautiful. It also potentially really quickly reveals why no young people are engaging with your Sunday services. It's a bizarre pitch for a Sunday morning activity. So, yeah. And so now our equation, because we've used the shorthand, our equation actually turns into something more like this. It's a lecture and a sing-along on a Sunday, and that equals good. But that doesn't necessarily, just because, sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. So the container of the word church is good. We all agree with the first statement, but we've now made the assumption that the lecture and a sing-along, the contents of that container word, also means good. But it's not always necessarily the case. And we haven't even described good here. We've managed to get all the way to this point in the conversation. And good, what kind of good? What does the good actually mean? Who is it good to? Who is it good for? What are the costs of achieving this good? So as you can see here, what a simple term that most people would say and operate by. You can see that it's just creating a lot of more friction and not actually giving us tangible, practical steps that we can execute and do well. Yeah, and so most of this goes back to we need to know what we're achieving and how we know we've achieved it. And some of these words don't necessarily support that. See, words like discipleship, doing life together, they typically create more questions than answers. A fun component of theology, we love it. We love discussing these things, absolutely. But in the particular job of strategic planning, this is where it starts to fall apart a little bit. So we're suggesting here today that actually some of our hope or like our confusion as to what's happening with church is mainly because we're just narrowed down to a tried and true familiar concept, because we're not using the correct language around what we're trying to achieve. All right, Jess.
Jess, just before you talk, I'm just going to ask if everybody can see the speaker as well as seeing the screen. Is there anybody who isn't sure about if they can't see the speakers? So you're all okay? Because if you need to, if you go up the top of your screen where it says view and click on that, you can see the screen share plus pictures of those that are still on video. But there we go. So over to you, Jess. Thank you.
Kia ora. Love Zoom. So Bridie has identified that if church is a traditional Sunday morning service, then how we are embodying the church in the world may be woefully insufficient for meeting the needs of our communities. Tep has then challenged us that if we assume that this definition of church is universally good, then we are restricting our imagination of what church can look like. God is ultimately bigger than a Sunday morning service. We know this. And yet we insist that we're not doing it right unless we pack hundreds into an auditorium. Against this backdrop, it is our conviction that hope is found when we remember that God is an endlessly creative God who placed in us God's own endlessly creative spirit. If our Sunday services aren't ministering to the needs of our communities, we can change them. If we're losing hope because we've narrowed our view of what church is, we can widen the lens. In our own context, finding hope again in church started with what we had. First, we identified what the spiritual needs around us were to the best of our ability. We had a small group of young adults who wanted to ask questions after a sermon, and a sparse congregation already meeting at 11:30 that were eager to engage more deeply in their faith and have a renewed vitality in their gathering. Church leadership was also interested in developing intergenerational relationships throughout the parish. Therefore, we determined that the kind of church good we needed was a space where people could discuss life and faith and question together as equals around the table. Informed by this, we shaped a discussion service that would be primarily lay-led, meaning that anyone could roster themselves to help facilitate discussion week to week. We made some decisions along the way. The decision to not have sung worship or a formal Eucharist was purely practical. We didn't want the service to get too long. We didn't have a lot of musicians around anyway. And we didn't want it to be compulsory for our already very stretched clergy to attend. In saying this, we did liturgically shape up our brunch meal as a kind of informal Eucharist. And we made a collective commitment to provide food for one another and clean it all up afterwards. And this really became like an essential expression of manaakitanga and belonging. Finally, we assessed what language would be best to communicate our service's purpose and goals. Deciding to call the service Faith Discussions with Brunch, while not very sexy, literally captures what people can expect at this service. Faith discussions and brunch. Bridie talked about survivorship bias before. And while, yes, this service was designed around the needs of people we already had, we found that it really connected with others who were dissatisfied with or had been burned by the traditional service model. The Faith Discussions with Brunch service has been running for 3 years and has helped to transform our church into a place where wisdom and empathy are growing. Those brief words on the Faith Discussions with Brunch service that we started are all I want to offer. Because the fact of the matter is that we didn't design the Sunday service that would save the church. And we wouldn't necessarily recommend that you take these ideas and replicate them in your own church arbitrarily. The point we want to emphasize with you tonight is that engaging our creativity around what this service could be renewed our hope in church. And an essential part of that renewal was a commitment to meeting the spiritual needs of the community around us and using language that they could access. Likely, our approach was not nuanced or extensive enough, but it started us down the road of revision and reflection. And as we've departed from traditional success metrics of having bums on seats and tithing units, God has showed us again and again how God suspends and suffuses all of creation and requires no prerequisites to be present or active. Church is struggling, we know, and our services are definitely not the only thing we need to reform. But imagine how great it would be if we stopped running our Sunday services the way we always have just for the sake of it and started identifying the needs of the world around us first and applying ourselves second. Some of the tools in our kete would stay, but others would need to be put aside so that we could dream new dreams. If Sunday is stale, or is a source of anxiety for you as a leader, or is disconnected from the people in your wider community, we encourage you to return your focus to these questions. What spiritual needs need to be met here? How can we work towards achieving those needs? And how will we know when we have? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jess and Bridie and Tepene. Amazing, amazing. Thank you. I really loved your word Christianese. I like that. And the jargon, I mean, it's a bit salutary when you see it all in front of you like that. Thank you so much for your thought and your introduction and the contextual explanation of what you've been doing and what you are doing and you have been doing for over 3 years. So I'm just going to stop the recording now so that people will feel free to respond.